He dips it into a small horn, shaped in quell beside him, black as midnight, thick as syrup, gleaming faintly in the candlelight. The ink is no ordinary mixture. It carries a legacy. This isn't just liquid to transfer thoughts. It is the blood of eternity. As the feather's tip kisses the page, a trail of deep, rich black follows, not fading like modern pens, but sinking into the parchment, staining it permanently, like memory etched into the soul. That ink, even after centuries, will remain sharp, almost defiant, as if the scribe who penned it never truly left. But what was this ink made of? It began with something almost poetic. Oak galls, small, round, tumor-like growths on oak trees, born from wasps laying their eggs in the tree's bark. Useless to most, but sacred to the monks. Inside each gall was a substance called tannic acid, powerful and binding. The monks would gather these galls by hand, drying them carefully in wooden crates stored beneath their cloisters. The process was patient, just like their prayers, nothing rushed, nothing wasted. Once dried, they would be crushed, sometimes between stones, other times ground into fine powder using simple mortars. The dust, bitter and brown, would be steeped in water for days until it became a thick, tea-colored broth. But that was only part of the alchemy. To this, they would add iron salts, often sourced from rusted nails or aged iron tools soaked in vinegar. The iron reacted with the tannic acid, darkening the brew into a rich, blue-black elixir. But the monks didn't stop there. To stabilize it, they'd add gum arabic, harvested from the sap of acacia trees, rare, precious, and traded over great distances. The gum thickened the ink and gave it a smooth, flowing consistency. Without it, the ink would bleed wildly across the page. With it, it obeyed the will of the quill. The recipe wasn't written down. It was memorized, passed quietly from master to apprentice. Each monk added his own small variation, a pinch more iron, a longer steeping time, a different gall. But the essence remained unchanged. Gall, iron, gum, patience. Some of the ink was so good, so chemically bonded to the parchment, that even now, 1,000 years later, it reads clear as day. In libraries across Europe, in the British Library, in Vatican vaults, in forgotten monasteries, you'll find books, letters, and Bibles written in it. Ink that refused to fade, and the monks knew. They weren't writing for tomorrow. They were writing for eternity. So they sat, hour after hour, shaping each letter like a prayer, each word like a brick in the great cathedral of time. The ink, so permanent, made their work sacred. Mistakes weren't crossed out, they were feared. Every line had to be deliberate, true. Outside the scriptorium, kingdoms rose and fell, armies marched, plagues came and went. But inside those abbey walls, the ink remained steady. And as the monk leaned back to stretch his aching fingers, he didn't smile. He prayed that his words would outlive him, that centuries from now, anyone would read the line he'd just written, and know he once lived. The monastery bell tolls low in the distance, 1, 2, 3, a reminder that time still marches, even when ink attempts to anchor it. In the dim corridors beneath the chapel, beneath the singing of psalms, another monk tends to the ink pots. He is not a scribe, but an artifex atrimenti, a rare figure in monastic life, the ink master. His name is Brother Alcuin, and his world is not of parchment and poetry, but of cauldrons, minerals, and silence. His fingers are permanently stained brown, black. His robes smell of rust and sap. Where the scribes pray in Latin, he speaks to metals and roots. Inside a small stone room, no larger than a stable stall, Brother Alcuin brews what the others use. This, the monks say, is the womb of ink. On wooden shelves sit dozens of jars, oak galls of every hue, fragments of rusting iron nails, dried acacia sap wrapped in muslin cloth, old leather sacks filled with soot from burnt bones carbon for darker shading. The ink was never simply mixed, it was conjured, slowly and carefully, like a liturgy. First came the gall water, a strange, sour-smelling liquid brewed from boiled and fermented oak galls. It was not uncommon for Brother Alcuin to leave them steeping in sun, warmed jars for up to 3 weeks, until the brew turned dark brown and almost bitter enough to sting the air. Then in came the iron sulfate. This was not always easy to procure. In monasteries close to towns or smithies, monks would scrape the rust from old hinges, wheels, or chains. Others traded honey, cheese, or labor for crumbling iron filings soaked in vinegar. The iron, when dropped into the gall solution, would bloom into ink before their eyes, a chemical miracle. The moment the iron touched the tannic brew, the liquid would swirl black suddenly, violently, a silent little storm in a wooden bowl. The alchemy of it struck even hardened monks as divine. Something lifeless and dull was becoming eternal. To bind it all, gum, Arabic delicate, translucent flakes, was melted gently over coals and stirred in, thickening the mixture to a slow, syrupy flow. A rhythm emerged: gather, grind, steep, bind, a sacred pattern not unlike the rhythm of the prayers above. But the work wasn't just technical, it was philosophical. Brother Alcuin once told a novice, ink must not simply last, it must obey the quill, obey the parchment, obey the thought of the hand that writes it. The ink had to flow smoothly but dry quickly. It needed to be dark enough to read by candlelight, but not so acidic that it ate through the page. If made improperly, it could corrode parchment over time. Many a careless monk ruined his manuscript with ink too rich in iron, which bled through like spilled wine and devoured sacred text. And so, in the quiet of night, Alcuin would test batch after batch. He would dip a reed into the ink, write a line on calfskin, then leave it by the window for days, watching how it dried, how it aged. Some formulas faded into greenish gray, others hardened into black crystal, too stiff to write with, but the perfect recipe, that elusive balance that was his life's devotion. Over time, he grew more precise. 1 part gall, half part iron, a whisper of gum, a day's rest before use. He began documenting his recipes in code, hidden in the margins of sermons and psalters, just in case some less pious soul tried to steal the monastery's secret formula. It wasn't just pride, it was survival. The ink made the monastery valuable. Townspeople would send letters to be copied there. Nobles would pay in silver to have Bibles transcribed. Other monks came from afar, just to see the unblotted blackness of the abbey's script. Brother Alcuin never took credit. When thanked, he'd say, "The Lord made the oak. The Lord made the wasp. I only listen." And then he'd go back to stirring, in a room darker than dusk, brewing blackness that would outlive them all. There is something quietly heroic about resisting the decay of time, and in their dim scriptoriums, the monks, though they wielded no swords and wore no armor, did exactly that. To the modern eye, iron gall ink is simply a liquid, a stain, but to the monks of the Middle Ages, it was alchemy. It was the whisper of permanence. The process was deceptively humble. You begin with a gall, not a seed, not a nut, but a wart, like growth that forms on oak trees when a wasp lays its egg inside a budding leaf. Nature's accident, born of irritation. Yet from this blemish, the monks extracted the soul of their ink. Each gall was harvested from ancient oak trees, the very ones whose roots drank from centuries past. The monks crushed them carefully, extracting a dark, tannic substance rich in gallic acid. To this they added a bitter mix of copperas iron sulfate, usually scraped from stones in old mines or soaked from rusty nails in rainwater. The moment the iron touched the tannin, a deep alchemical transformation took place. It wasn't instant. The ink would start as pale, almost invisible like water on the page, but with air, with breath, with time it blackened. It darkened like secrets buried and rising. What began faint became indelible. The monks knew this. They trusted it, the same way they trusted the rhythm of liturgy, the rising sun, or the turning of seasons. They didn't need to see permanence instantly. They had patience, and over the years they perfected the recipe, balancing the acidity just right, not too corrosive to destroy the parchment, but potent enough to outlast moths, mold, and fire. They didn't call it chemistry. They called it obedience, because the ink did not belong to them. It belonged to the scripture, to God, to history. Each monk was simply a steward. By the time the ink dried on their handmade parchment, It had already begun its long pilgrimage through time. But not every stroke was easy. Why the medieval church banned forks, and what it says about power, purity, and fear, it began not with thunder, but with silver two sharp, shining prongs glinting in the candlelight of a noblewoman's hand. The year was 1004, and the setting was Venice, a city between sea and sky, where whispers carried over canals and shadows curled like incense around the columns of grand cathedrals. Into this tapestry stepped a Byzantine princess, sent westward from Constantinople, bearing silks, spices, and something far stranger, a fork. To the Venetian court she was a vision, her voice soft as oil on parchment, her garments stitched with gold thread, her table habits impossibly refined. But it was when she lifted that small, two-pronged utensil to eat, avoiding the touch of food upon her fingers, that something inside the watching priests curdled. In silence, they noted her dainty gestures, her precise separations of fig from flesh, bread from oil. She touched nothing. Her lips never grazed the meat. To them, it was unnatural. It wasn't just foreign. It was offensive, because the fork, though beautiful, separated woman from bread, body from labor, humanity from humility. And in the medieval world, you especially within the church that was dangerous, there is a rhythm in medieval thought. Suffering is sacred. Flesh is flawed. Holiness comes through hardship, not convenience. And the fork, delicate and dainty, suggested something different, that one might elevate themselves above the mess of eating, that one's hands might remain clean where Christ's did not. So, when the princess died young, likely of plague or fever, a Venetian cleric recorded her demise with chilling certainty. God, he wrote, in his wisdom, struck her down, for she had used a little golden fork. Thus began the superstition. In the quiet cloisters of medieval monasteries, where meals were taken in near silence and prayers were whispered more often than names, eating was never just about hunger. It was ritual. The table was a place of humility, of community, and above all of spiritual discipline. Bread was broken, not sliced. Hands, not utensils, connected man to creation. Every morsel consumed with fingers reminded the eater of Christ's body, broken and shared. The feel of crust and flesh, the texture of beans or barley stew, was as sacred as the psalms recited between bites. So when the fork appeared dainty, distant, and foreign, it was more than a novelty, it was a rupture. Church leaders, especially in the Latin West, saw the fork not just as a tool, but as a gesture of pride. Where the hand had always humbled itself to touch food to get sticky with honey, stained with dates, and wet with the oil of fish, the fork denied that contact. It preserved the eater's cleanliness. But cleanliness to the church was not always a virtue. Too clean, too detached, and you risked becoming unholy. In Florence, a bishop famously preached that fingers were made by God, but forks were made by the devil. There was a symbolism to it, sharp and unavoidable. The fork's prongs, usually two, sometimes three, reminded many priests of the pitchfork, of the devil's own implement. Long before Dante imagined hell's torments in vivid detail, the idea of the devil's fork had crept into sermons, art, and fear. The church's resistance wasn't just about cutlery. It was about control. To accept the fork meant to accept foreign customs, particularly Byzantine ones, and the East was already seen as suspicious. The split between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches, though not yet formalized, was brewing. The fork, elegant and Eastern, became yet another symbol of creeping heresy. In monasteries from Burgundy to Canterbury, the fork was banned outright. Some abbots would not allow a monk to enter the refectory with one. Others would see to it that anyone found using a fork during meals fasted the next day in penance. And so, what could have been a minor innovation in table etiquette became instead a spiritual battlefield. But the people who did use forks, they weren't always princesses or heretics. Sometimes they were physicians. Sometimes they were poets. Sometimes they were widows who simply didn't want their sleeves dragging through stew. Still, the church held the line for now. In the next section, we travel to the High Middle Ages, where the tides begin to shift. A new class is rising. Merchants, travelers, and thinkers are beginning to question old customs. And in the court of a certain king of France, a fork appears again not as sin, but as sophistication. It was not a monk who brought the fork back into favor, nor a pope, nor a priest, but a king. Or rather, a king's court. By the mid-14th century, the court of France had become a stage where elegance was performed daily. Silks fluttering in draughty halls, spices stirred into stews with foreign names, and music that lilted like wind over old stone. It was here, in this delicate theater of mannered excess, that the fork quietly re-entered Europe not as rebellion, but as refinement. Imagine a nobleman in gold, threaded robes, leaning over a gilded plate. Before him roasted quail glistening with honey, figs soaked in wine, almonds pounded into paste. These were not foods to be eaten greedily, torn by hand in great primal bites. No, these were foods meant to be savored, touched delicately, plucked even, and so the fork, which had once been damned by bishops as devilish, now shimmered in candlelight beside goblets and platters. At first, they were simple, narrow, curved, often with just two tines. But their elegance was unmistakable. Unlike knives, which still hinted at violence, or fingers, which reminded everyone of peasants and priests, the fork seemed, above it all. The French nobility took to it slowly, cautiously. But once adopted, they never looked back. Not everyone approved. One chronicler from the region of Limoges wrote with thinly veiled contempt of those who pierced their meat like cruel executioners, referring, of course, to fork users. In more rustic corners of France, it was considered effeminate, even cowardly, for a man to use a fork. Real men, it was said, ate with fingers stained red from roasted game or brown from gravy. But in Paris was changing. It was the city of poets now, of philosophers, of perfume. In its salons, talk drifted from astronomy to etiquette. The way you ate said as much about you as the clothes you wore. And while the church still muttered about humility, the nobility responded with a new gospel, elegance, and then came Catherine de Medici, an Italian by birth, a queen by marriage, and a force of culture like few others in European history. When she married into the French royal family in the 16th century, she brought with her a caravan of chefs, artisans, and yes, forks, dozens of them, crafted in Florence, silver, slender, shining. It wasn't long before French nobles began to copy her. Not out of need, but out of awe. She didn't preach, she didn't scold. She simply dined gracefully, regally, with fork in hand and watched the world imitate. By the end of that century, the fork was no longer a scandal in France. It was a statement of wealth, of cleanliness, of culture. What had once been exiled as sinful was now desired as fashionable. It would take centuries more for the fork to fully conquer Europe, but in France, its battle was already won. Across the English Channel, the fork did not find open arms. If France had embraced it like a lover, England received it like a stray dog, sniffed at, tolerated at best, and shooed away more often than not. It is the early 1600s. Imagine a dim hall in London, smoke curling from tallow candles, the heavy smell of mutton and mead thick in the air. A nobleman, perhaps a visiting diplomat from Florence, sits at the long table. He reaches calmly for the strange little instrument beside his trencher. 2 tines, delicate curve, quiet dignity. He spears a sliver of pear, brings it to his lips, and chews with slow elegance. Across the table, his English hosts raise their eyebrows. Some smirk, others laugh openly. One man wipes his greasy fingers on his cloak and leans in. "What's the matter, friend?" he says with a grin. "Afraid of touching your own dinner." It was a matter of pride in England. Fingers, after all, were practical, honest. To use anything else was considered foreign, almost unmanly. Even Thomas Coryat, one of the earliest English fork advocates, was mocked in his day. After traveling through Italy and witnessing the fork in daily use, Coryat returned to England and dared to introduce it at the table. He was ridiculed mercilessly. His friends dubbed him furcifer, Latin for fork, bearer, and not in praise. Satirical poems circulated, mocking his dainty ways. The fork, they claimed, was for those too precious to dirty their fingers, and preciousness, in post-Elizabethan England, was the stuff of jest. It didn't help that the fork came with a whiff of the foreign and the feminine, two traits that suspicious Englishmen, especially in the wake of the Protestant Reformation and increasing nationalism, viewed with squinting distrust. In taverns and manors alike, the knife remained king. A sturdy blade, used both to cut and to scoop, served every function a diner could need, and fingers, when clean enough, did the rest. Bread soaked up sauce. Meat was torn, not pierced. The mouth, wide and ready, met food like a soldier meets his orders, without fuss, but change, even in England, came eventually, quietly, not with declarations, but with imitation. First among the royals, then among the nobles. As trade with the continent grew, as English merchants sat at Venetian tables, as ambassadors returned from the courts of France and Austria with tales of porcelain and silver, the fork began to slip in, almost unnoticed. One day it was seen at the Duke's wedding feast. A month later, in the hands of a bishop. By the late 1600s, it had crept its way into aristocratic dining rooms, not yet essential, but no longer alien. The tide had turned. The fork had found its place, if not in every hand, then at least beside every plate. In Germany, the story was similar but colder. The Germans, lovers of structure and pragmatism, saw the fork not as sin or scandal, but as unnecessary. For centuries their cuisine was hearty, heavy, dense, pork knuckles and thick sausages, stews that clung to spoons. What need was there for a pronged delicacy when your dinner came in slabs? But practicality has its own path to progress. By the 18th century, as dining etiquette spread from Versailles to Vienna, the fork slowly carved a niche for itself in German-speaking lands. By then, it was less about food and more about status. To use a fork was to signal you belonged to the New Europe, one of lace cuffs, powdered wigs, and gilded etiquette manuals. And so, even in the lands where it was once scorned or ignored, the fork persisted. Its journey had taken nearly 1,000 years, from Byzantium to Venice, from Florence to Paris, and now into London, Munich, Prague. It moved like a shadow, quietly adapting, waiting for the world to catch up to its grace. How soap nearly caused a medieval war. Imagine a world where smelling too clean could get you accused of witchcraft. It is the year 1325, and a warm wind moves through the hills of southern France. In the bustling town of Toulouse, where cobbled streets wind through busy markets in crimson, robed clerics pace the cathedral square. Something strange is afoot. A merchant has arrived from the distant Islamic city of Aleppo. With him he brings a waxy, fragrant block soft green and smelling of olive and laurel. It is soap, not the gray, harsh lye soap known to peasants, but the kind that leaves skin soft and sweet as citrus. The nobles are curious, the church is not. For centuries, Europeans bathed only rarely, with water reserved for souls and sins. To scrub the body too clean was considered vain, even dangerous. The more you wash, they warned, the more holes you make for the devil to slip in. But suddenly, soap is everywhere. By 1331, the women of noble courts dabbed their wrists with it. Crusader knights import it by the crate. Even the Queen of Navarre commissions a barrel engraved with lilies. But with each scented breeze, suspicion deepens. Why? Because this soap is Arab, and it smells like heresy. In Paris, a monk writes, "What need has the soul for perfumes? These oils are the masks of the wicked." In Florence, a bishop condemns soap as a Muslim plot to weaken Christian flesh and morals alike. Soon, rival kingdoms clash not with swords, but fragrance. It began quietly, as most revolutions do with lather and envy. In the royal courts of Avignon, nestled on the river Rhone, Pope John Roman XXII notices something strange. His cardinals, once cloaked in incense and damp wool, now smell like citrus and bay leaf. Not all, of course, just a few. The younger ones, the ambitious ones, the ones who whisper in corners and leave no ashes on their sleeves. He summons Brother Antoine, a trusted monastic scribe. They say the Florentines have begun boiling oil and ashes, that even merchants now dab their collars before prayer. Find out who brought this perfume to my court. Brother Antoine does what scribes do best. He writes letters. Dozens of them, to monks in Naples, apothecaries in Marseille, even a Saracen physician in Palermo. The replies return slowly, with ink smudged and edges curled from distant journeys. They all point to the same thing, Aleppo soap green as olive leaves and smooth as gilt. But behind the fragrance lies something more potent, prestige. For the ruling class, cleanliness becomes a code, a silent war of elegance. A woman whose hands do not reek of garlic must surely dine with gold forks. A bishop who carries no scent must surely sleep on straw. Soap, it turns out, is not just hygiene, it is status. In Florence, noblewomen begin hosting secret soap salons. Over honeyed figs and wine, they exchange recipes smuggled from Moorish Spain. Laurel oil, goat tallow, even crushed pomegranate. These soaps are hidden beneath bedposts, behind altar cloths, and locked in chests beside dowry pearls. But not everyone approves. In Bologna, a sermon thunders, brothers, they wash their flesh as if it were sacred, but it is the soul that must be scrubbed. These perfumed harlots will burn with their soaps. Crowds cheer. Elsewhere, crowds jeer. In Genoa, a street riot erupts when a bishop bans the sale of imported soap in a market square. Soap makers, fearing ruin, rally the butchers and bakers. Within hours, barrels are smashed, a priest is pelted with goat fat, and the bells of San Lorenzo ring in confusion, not prayer. The king of Naples, watching from afar, sees opportunity. If the Pope bans foreign soap, Naples will corner the southern trade. If France sends its bishops, he says slyly, then Naples shall send its soldiers. He commissions a royal soapworks, its emblem a winged lion clutching a bar of olive soap. Knights are ordered to wash before jousts. Ambassadors are given perfumed cakes to carry to foreign courts. Naples smells better and rises faster. France, feeling mocked, retaliates. Letters are sent. Threats are made. Papal edicts drafted in lavender ink. What started as a whiff of change has now turned into a windstorm of suspicion. The year is 1326. Bells toll low across the hills of Toulouse, but their echo carries something new paranoia. A merchant's wife is dragged from her home at dawn, not for heresy, not for theft, but for soap. The neighbors say she smelled of clove and myrrh. Too sweet, too foreign. The local bishop suspects she's been buying contraband from a Moorish trader at the southern docks. Worse, they say she shared her stash with other wives. A secret circle of scrubbed elbows and silent defiance. She is put on trial not before the king, but before the nose. In a town square ringed with hawthorn branches and chanting friars, she stands weeping. Her soap's pale green ivory, even one tinted rose are laid out like relics. Monks take turns sniffing each cake. Their faces tighten, one faints. Another declares the scent Luciferian. She is fined 30 silver deniers, equal to 2 cows and a cask of Bordeaux. But the punishment doesn't stop her neighbors. If anything, it makes the soap more precious. In Paris, ladies hide slivers of soap inside hollow, stout books of psalms. In Lyon, apothecaries begin selling tooth powders that smell suspiciously like Aleppo soap. Even monks, sworn to poverty, trade soap for quills and cheese. The church tries to clamp down, but it is like trying to ban moonlight. In Avignon, Pope John Roman XXII issues a papal bull. Let not the body be perfumed more than the spirit is cleansed. But bishops whisper. His Holiness himself bathes once a month. Rumors swirl. Did the Pope receive a gift from the Emir of Granada, a box of lemons, scented soap carved with verses from the Koran? Did the Queen of Navarre secretly bathe in rose water after Mass? In the taverns of Marseille, soap becomes code for sedition. He smells too fine to be loyal. One drunkard mutters, staggering from the docks. Meanwhile, Naples grows richer. With every ban in the north, demand in the south rises. Its royal soapworks expand. New blends are invented: rosemary for soldiers, chamomile for monks, bergamot for ambassadors. trade ships sail under the crescent moon, carrying fragrant treasure as valuable as silk. Florence, ever the rival, cannot stand aside. The Medici, still young and grasping, sponsor secret guilds to perfect their own soap. Alchemists in stone towers burn midnight oil, testing laurel ratios and goat lard infusions. One even dies from inhaling caustic lime and is buried with a soapstone tablet carved with the words, "Clean hands, cleaner soul." The tension now boils over. Provence accuses Naples of soap piracy, intercepting a barge meant for Aragon. France accuses Florence of undermining church edicts. Genoa bans scented soaps entirely. Markets empty. Sailors fight over soap in port cities. By spring, several baronies begin building barricades around public wells, fearful that foreign soap will poison the water. All because of fragrance. All because of the right to smell clean. The filthy professions that built civilization dirty jobs in history before empires were built, and cities rose with towering walls. Humanity had one inescapable, grim necessity, dealing with the dead. Grave digging is one of the oldest professions known to man, yet it's rarely spoken of with reverence. In ancient Mesopotamia, where written language first bloomed on clay tablets, there were also tablets chronicling death and those who managed it. Grave diggers were not merely manual laborers. They were spiritual intermediaries, often tasked with performing rites that ensured the dead wouldn't return to haunt the living. Imagine the summer heat baking the sands of ancient Babylon. A man, clothed in linen ragged from years of toil, carries a dull, bent bronze shovel. The burial grounds lie just beyond the city walls, plagued with jackals at night and the ever-looming fear of pestilence. The dead weren't always buried in peace. During times of war or plague, grave diggers sometimes worked from dawn until exhaustion, their hands blistered, their lungs filled with the dust of decay. Despite their importance, they were often considered untouchable, unclean. In ancient Egypt, tomb workers lived in a village of their own, Deir el-Medina. Their job wasn't just to dig holes, but to craft eternity. They painted intricate scenes inside the tombs of pharaohs, believing these depictions would come to life in the afterlife. Though more respected than most, even these skilled artisans were often ostracized by the rest of society, their contact with death rendering them impure in the eyes of the living. Moving eastward to China during the Han Dynasty, grave diggers had yet another burden, ensuring no grave robbers could disturb the resting. They often devised booby traps and elaborate tomb designs to foil intruders. But the irony, many grave diggers became robbers themselves, tempted by the riches they buried. These people lived in the margins neither of the world of the living nor entirely embraced by the world of the dead. And yet, without them, society would collapse into chaos and disease. Every city, every dynasty, every ancient culture owed a quiet debt to these filthy but essential custodians of humanity. If you think modern jobs are tough, consider a day in the life of a Roman fuller or medieval tanner artisans whose crafts relied on rot, urine, and filth. Let's start in ancient Rome. The fuller was the dry cleaner of antiquity. Citizens brought their togas, tunics, and linens to the Falonica, a workshop of stink and steam. Cleaning clothes wasn't as simple as rinsing in water. No, it involved fermenting urine, rich in ammonia, used to bleach and soften garments. Fullers would collect urine from public urinals strategically placed around the city. Yes, urine taxes were real. The clothes were soaked, then stomped on by barefoot workers in large vats, a pungent ballet of human effort and tolerance for smell. The stench was unbearable, the risks high. Inhaling ammonia day after day caused respiratory issues. Skin cracked and bled from constant exposure. But without fullers, Roman citizens, even senators, would walk the forum in stained, stiff robes. Their dignity relied on the indignity of others. Now shift to medieval Europe, where the tanner worked his gruesome craft. Turning animal hide into usable leather was an art drenched in brutality. First, the hides were soaked in water to soften, then in a mixture of lime and urine to loosen hair and fat. The smell could travel miles. Workers used knives to scrape the flesh, then bathed the hides in a slurry of animal brains, dung, and more urine to make them supple. Tanners were often banished to the outskirts of towns not just because of the smell, but because their work was seen as spiritually dirty. Their children were considered poor marriage prospects, and yet every cobbler, knight, archer, and farmer relied on their leather. From shoes to saddles, bookbindings to belts, civilization was stitched together by these men working in excrement and secrecy. The irony is painful and poetic. The more essential the job, the more despised the worker. Fullers and tanners gave us elegance and utility at the cost of their own social standing and health. Civilization walked in leather boots, but looked away from the hands that made them. There is a particular silence that falls over a city just before dawn, a thick, damp quiet that clings to the walls and seeps into the cobblestones. In 18th century London, that silence was often broken not by the chirping of birds, but by the slosh of buckets and the wheeze of tired men dragging carts through the back alleys. These were the night soil men, invisible laborers who hauled away what the city wished to forget, its human waste. They moved like shadows, cloaked in the stink of cesspits and privies, earning their coin not by skill or sword, but by sheer tolerance for filth. Their job was to empty the night soil, the polite term for what collected in chamber pots, outhouses, and cesspits before the city awoke. It was brutal, back-breaking work, done under cover of darkness because no one wanted to see, smell, or acknowledge what had to be done to keep civilization running. The men worked in pairs or teams, often with a cart drawn by a donkey, or, for the more unfortunate, pulled by hand. They would arrive at designated homes, lift up trapdoors in the back garden, and lower their long, handled buckets into the pits below. Some cesspits were decades old, filled with a slurry of waste, straw, and rot. The smell was beyond comprehension. It wasn't merely foul, it was heavy, suffocating, a stench that sank into your skin and didn't leave for days. But even among the lowest of the low, there were dangers. The pits could collapse. Methane could build up and explode with a single spark. Men drowned in these places. One documented incident in Holborn tells of a night soil man who slipped, cracked his head, and fell face, burst into a cesspit. He was dead before they could even reach him. Worse still were the rats. London, in its filthier centuries, was a city made for rats. They infested every corner, gorging themselves on the same waste the night soil men came to collect. In the pitch, dark, more than one worker reported feeling rats scurry across their feet or hearing the splash of something large moving through the pit below. To make matters worse, night soil men were hated, ridiculed, and ostracized. No matter how vital their work, they were considered unclean both physically and morally. Women crossed the street when they passed. Children threw stones, yet without them the city would choke on its own filth. Some found a strange pride in their work. There was a kind of dark camaraderie among them, a knowledge that they were doing the work no one else dared. Their reward was meager, but it bought bread, and sometimes that was enough. But the job took a toll. Many died young, lungs rotted from toxic fumes or infections. Few retired, fewer were remembered. They simply disappeared back into the mud. And when the sun rose, London carried on as if they'd never existed. One might imagine that making soap the very emblem of cleanliness would be a pleasant, perfumed task. But in pre-modern Europe, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries, soap was born from some of the foulest concoctions mankind ever stirred. The process began with fat, not the kind you pick up in tidy packages from the butcher, but rancid animal fat, leftover scraps from slaughterhouses, fat skimmed off boiling pots, and even the refuse from kitchens and candle makers. This fat was boiled down until it became a thick, greasy sludge. The stench, as you might imagine, was staggering. Neighbors complained constantly about soap factories, which were typically tucked far from polite society, near rivers or industrial districts. But fat alone did not make soap. It had to be mixed with lye, a caustic substance often derived from wood ash or urine. That's right, human or animal urine collected in jars from taverns or households. Mixed together, these ingredients would boil for days in massive cauldrons, tended by soap boilers covered in burns and blisters. The heat was intense. The fumes were worse. Breathing them in over time could burn the lungs, corrode teeth, and cause permanent damage. Soap boilers rarely lived long lives. Nearby, another profession labored in equal misery, the tanners. Tanning hides into leather was an ancient and essential craft, but it required working with animal skins that were often rotting when they arrived. The first step was to soak the hides in urine to soften them. Then came the baiting process, which involved smearing them with fermented animal dung to help break down the fibers. Yes, actual feces. The hides would then be scraped, stretched, and soaked in increasingly foul mixtures until they were finally tanned in pits of tannic acid, often derived from oak bark. The entire process took weeks, and the smell was said to cling to a tanner's skin for life. In many cities, tanners were banned from living within the town walls. They were required to set up shop downstream, quite literally beneath everyone else. Their children struggled to marry. Their houses, if you could call them that, were shunned by all but other tanner families. And yet, without them, there would be no boots, no saddles, no belts or books. Both the soap boilers and the tanners lived lives defined by contradiction, reviled for the very work that made society functional. Like the night soil men, they labored in the margins, sacrificed their health, and endured lifelong ostracization. Also, others could remain clean, clothed, and comfortable. It was a strange sort of dignity one found not in praise or position, but in purpose. If the night soil men of London worked by night to avoid public scorn, then the gong farmers of Tudor England worked even deeper in society's shadows. The word gong comes from the Old English gang, meaning to go specifically, to go to the privy. These men were paid to empty and transport human waste from cesspits and primitive toilets in the days before sewers. Their work was seasonal, grim, and brutally isolating. At night, they would descend into waste pits with buckets and long shovels, scraping up layers of thick, half-solid filth. The smell alone was enough to turn strong men faint, and yet this was their profession, often inherited from father to son. Gong farmers earned surprisingly high wages, not because the job was respected, but because few were desperate enough to do it. The penalty for abandoning the waste in public places was severe, so towns were forced to pay well to keep their streets tolerable. But no amount of silver could buy social standing. Gong farmers were prohibited from living in city centers. They were required to carry bells or wear distinctive clothing to warn others of their presence. It wasn't just the smell people believed, they carried moral filth too. Meanwhile, out in the marshes and ponds, leech collectors waded barefoot through muddy waters to harvest the medical miracle of the age, blood-sucking leeches. In the 18th and 19th centuries, leeches were prescribed for everything from headaches to fevers, and demand was massive. The best way to collect them, let them bite you. Women, often elderly or widowed, would walk into stagnant ponds and wait as dozens of tiny mouths attached to their legs. They'd stand still for hours, blood running down their shins, sometimes fainting from blood loss or developing infections. There were no antiseptics, no compensation for disease, just pennies per bucket. Some tried using animals instead, old horses or dogs, but many couldn't afford to sacrifice livestock, so they bled. These collectors would sell their harvests to apothecaries and doctors, who rarely acknowledged the suffering required to fill their jars, and yet the work went on. These women, and sometimes children, became a silent part of medical history, never named in books, but vital to the bloodletting practices that shaped centuries of healing. Their pain was considered a necessary evil. A background cost to someone else's cure. This was the pattern across history. The dirty jobs, the ones soaked in blood, waste, or rot, were always pushed to the edge of society. Their doers were necessary but never celebrated. They were ghosts by daylight, shadows at night. But in peeling back their stories, we begin to see the truth that history is not just shaped by kings and scholars, but by the anonymous hands that cleaned, carried, buried, and bled. They bore the weight of disgust so others could live in comfort, and in their silence lies the echo of a dignity few dared to see. The forgotten underdogs of war jobs that quietly won battles. They weren't soldiers, at least not in the traditional sense. They didn't wear medals, or hold rifles, or march in tidy lines. And yet, tucked beneath the roar of artillery and the thunder of advancing troops, they played a role so crucial that entire operations hinged on their survival. This is not the story of generals and glory, this is the story of the quiet heroes of wartime, the ones history almost forgot. It begins in a damp loft above a pub in the English countryside in 1916. There, amidst fluttering feathers and the cooing of restless wings, a team of pigeons were being fitted with tiny brass cylinders on their legs, each containing secret handwritten messages. Their trainer, an old postman turned wartime specialist named Albert, had memorized the flight paths by heart. With every launch, he watched them disappear into the fog, praying they'd dodge bullets, falcons, and the unpredictable wrath of weather. These birds, dubbed winged warriors, were more than pets. They were the frontline communication system when radios failed or were intercepted. One pigeon, Sher Ami, even flew 25 miles through enemy fire with a shattered leg and a blinded eye, carrying a message that saved nearly 200 soldiers trapped behind enemy lines. For this, she received the Croix de Guerre, a military honor from France. Yes, a pigeon earned a medal, while men in polished boots ignored her kind altogether. While pigeons flew above, beneath the earth, another group toiled in shadows, the tunnelers. In WWI and WW2, they were often miners and farmers conscripted for a job that demanded silence and nerves of steel. They crawled through muddy shafts beneath enemy trenches, planting explosives to collapse bunkers above. Their work was slow, claustrophobic, and deadly. Many died in collapses or were buried alive, but their sabotage turned tides in several key battles. No cheering crowds welcomed them home. Elsewhere in Europe, and later in the Pacific, a group of foragers and cooks kept entire units alive. Wartime chefs, many of them women disguised as men, or older civilians devised ways to stretch rations, turn moldy potatoes into soup, or catch rats for protein when supplies ran dry. Some even learned to ferment bread into makeshift alcohol to keep morale alive. One Belgian cook, Henriette Dupont, fed an entire battalion with nothing but nettles, stale biscuits, and swamp fish for a month, earning the nickname Swamp Queen. Then there were the laundry women and tailors, forgotten under the folds of time. They mended bullet-torn uniforms, sewed secret pockets for smuggling maps, and even embedded coded embroidery to pass information. One elderly tailor in Warsaw used silk thread to stitch a map of Nazi checkpoints inside a soldier's collar. That soldier would later lead a resistance cell with that very map, but perhaps the most unsung of all were the grave diggers. Their job was neither glorious nor celebrated. In the dead of night, while others slept or fought, they buried the fallen, often without names, markers, or prayer. In Normandy, a group of elderly monks volunteered to be gravediggers after the D-Day landings. Each night, they lit a candle and whispered the name of each soldier they buried, even if the dog tags were foreign or unreadable. They believed every soul deserved to be remembered. War, it turns out, isn't won by generals alone. It's won in feathers, in mud, in aprons, in thread, and in silence. War is often told through bombs and bayonets, but beneath the chaos, it was buttons, baskets, and borrowed identities that sometimes delivered the most devastating blows. Imagine a French washerwoman walking calmly through a German-occupied village with a wicker basket of dirty uniforms. To the average soldier, she was invisible, but to the Allied intelligence agencies, she was a critical asset, a courier of secrets stitched into seams, smudged onto handkerchiefs, or pinned beneath collars. In WW2, one of the most effective underground spy networks in Europe wasn't made up of trained soldiers, but seamstresses, maids, barbers, and bakers. These everyday civilians were the perfect spies. Their presence was expected, their movements overlooked. And so they listened, they watched, and they passed information in ways no one suspected. Take, for example, Violette Dubois, a seamstress in occupied Paris. By day, she mended officer uniforms. By night, she unraveled battle plans. Her tiny backroom was a symphony of scissors, thread, and whispers. Officers would speak freely in her presence, assuming her ignorance. But she wasn't just listening, she was memorizing. With each uniform she returned, she tucked coded messages into the linings. A red stitch near the hem meant increased troop movement. A double seam inside the cuff meant new anti-aircraft guns were being deployed. One of the most daring operations in Poland involved a team of laundresses who worked in a German military barracks. They passed intelligence by arranging laundry pins in specific ways on clotheslines. A shirt pinned upside down meant tanks were on the move. A missing sock signaled an incoming supply drop. Allied pilots would fly overhead, glance at the laundry below, and adjust their routes or drop zones accordingly. It sounds like fiction, but in a war where radios were jammed and trust was scarce, this was reality. Even children were part of this quiet revolution. In the Netherlands, a group of young girls known as the Courier Sisters delivered handwritten notes between resistance leaders by hiding them in their braids or rolling them into knitting needles. One 12-year-old girl, Annika, became a legend when she smuggled a map of German minefields by pretending to be mute and deaf, fooling dozens of checkpoints on her bicycle route. Meanwhile, in England, a clever housekeeper named Nellie Chambers operated under the code name Teapot. She worked in a manor house that had been converted into a command post for Nazi collaborators. Nellie eavesdropped while cleaning their rooms and relayed everything to the British Secret Service using teacups. Depending on how she placed them on the tray, she would signal different meanings to the local milkman, who was actually an MI5 operative. A cup facing left meant a meeting had been scheduled. A chipped saucer meant a message needed extraction. But perhaps no story captures the brilliance of these underdogs better than the tale of the handkerchief plot. In Prague, a textile factory worker named Jakub Novik devised a code using embroidered patterns. Each flower represented a number, each stitch angle represented a letter. He sent out dozens of handkerchiefs as gifts to soldiers' families. One such embroidered piece detailed the blueprints of a German chemical weapons facility. It made its way to London sewn inside a wedding veil. These weren't just clever tricks. They were lifelines. These invisible networks of ordinary people, tailors, washerwomen, cooks, gardeners, created a resistance so vast and so fluid that even the enemy had no idea how they were always one step behind. What made these spies so powerful wasn't their weapons or ranks. It was their ability to blend in, to become wallpaper, to vanish in plain sight. Because in a world trained to fear the loudest explosions, no one ever thought the deadliest secrets could be carried in a thread or whispered between rinsed sheets. If you'd wandered the backstreets of ancient Rome around the year 100 CE, your sandals would have kissed more than cobblestone. They would have tiptoed above a hidden marvel, one that whispered of rot and glory. For while Rome's marble temples dazzled the gods, it was her cloaca, the deep, dark veins of the Cloaca Maxima, that truly kept her alive. Welcome to the world beneath the Forum, where men didn't fight wars or philosophize, but bent over in darkness, waste, deep in a river of civilization's waste. The workers in the sewers were ghosts among the living. Called Forcarii or Closini, these men were usually slaves, criminals, or the poorest free citizens Rome had to offer. Armed with nothing but shovels, torches, and rags tied over their mouths, they waded through humanity's refuse. Animal guts, spoiled wine, parasite, infested feces, broken amphorae, and even the occasional dumped corpse. Every step could mean disease. Every crawl under those vaulted tunnels was a gamble with collapse, and yet the city above never paused to thank them, but it should have, for Rome's survival, through plagues, through heat, through siege, depended on the invisible work of its sewer slaves. Without them, the Tiber would have swollen with filth, streets would have reeked beyond bearable, and the elite's perfumed gardens would have choked on their own runoff. These workers didn't just clean, they preserved public health centuries before germ theory. They kept aqueducts from poisoning the populace. They were sanitation before sanitation was a science. Even more astonishing was the engineering. The Cloaca Maxima, originally a canal built by the Etruscans and expanded by the Romans, was a monumental structure. Lined with stone and vaulted like a cathedral to filth, it was strong enough for wagons to ride above while torrents flushed beneath. Rainwater mixed with household waste, flowed under bathhouses, temples, and taverns, and eventually exited into the Tiber. The sewer became so vital, Roman superstition even birthed a goddess for it, Closina, the spirit of purification. Shrines were built in her name, coins were tossed for favor, not unlike the modern Trevi fountain. And here, deep in this subterranean cathedral of filth, our underdog heroes worked. There are records, though sparse, of sewer workers risking their lives during floods, diving into churning black torrents to free blockages before disease could erupt. When the Forum was submerged during heavy rains, it was not senators who came with solutions. It was barefoot men with hooked poles and chains, unclogging the arteries of empire. Their names never made it to marble, but the water's flow was their silent legacy. And even in death, the sewers had their final say. Many criminals were executed by being cast into the Cloaca Maxima, a form of erasure, both literal and symbolic. The very workers who toiled there might someday join the stream in their own condemned flesh. But they toiled still. There is something humbling in imagining a Roman feast. A senator reclining on his side, drinking honeyed wine, throwing olive pits to the mosaic floor, while directly below, a sewer worker shovels grease and rot, ensuring the feast's excess never poisons the city. Two worlds, one stacked upon the other, civilization, upheld by unseen hands in the dark, and perhaps that is the great lesson of the sewers. That every golden age, every marble monument, every silk-robed ritual, is built atop something filthy, something necessary, something almost always forgotten. Beneath the streets, beneath the stories, flowed the unsung current of human resilience. Rome may have fallen, but in its ruins the sewers remain, dry now or overgrown, but still whispering the tales of those who carried civilization on their backs.